Let's start out this lecture with a short quiz. Don't worry, it won't be graded. Question 1. At big holidays, some people eat like birds and others like horses. What did you nosh on for breakfast at the last major holiday? Question 2. Many people consider breakfast to be the most important meal of the day, essential to good health. Do you always give breakfast to your kids every morning, like a good parent? Yes or no? Question 3. Which is the perfect breakfast meal? Pancakes or eggs? Question 4. At what time do you eat breakfast? 6 to 7 a.m., 7 to 8 a.m., or 8 to 9 a.m.? And question 5. On a scale from 1 to 5, where 1 means strongly disagree, 3 is neutral, and 5 is strongly agree, how do you respond to this statement? I make time for breakfast every day, and I eat it at my kitchen table with my family. That's it. So, what did you think of my quiz questions? Did you have trouble answering any of them? Did they seem like the typical sorts of questions you might see in a survey about breakfast? If I asked you to give me feedback on my quiz, what advice would you offer? Now hold on to those thoughts as we'll come back to them later. The quiz we just took is, of course, a type of survey. If you've ever filled out a questionnaire about a product, or rated a customer service agent after a transaction, or completed a census form, you've participated in a survey yourself. It seems that everyone wants our feedback on everything nowadays, preferably on a scale of 1 to 5 stars. Fundamentally, surveys are tools. They're questionnaires designed to gain feedback from multiple respondents on a given set of topics. The goal of survey research is to identify characteristics of a given population, people's attitudes, beliefs, goals, behaviors, preferences, opinions, by asking them questions. Surveys can be incredibly varied in length, approach, distribution method, and types of question. When surveys are aimed at a smaller number of people or allow the interviewer to significantly adapt his or her questions in response to what the respondent says, we refer to those as interviews. When we ask small groups to meet and offer their opinions, responding to each other as well as the interviewer, we call these focus groups. Classic survey research, however, focuses on interviewers following a set list of questions in a structured questionnaire to a lot of people, allowing researchers to compare data across a large sample of the population. They tend to produce more quantitative data compared to interviews and focus groups. Surveys are one of the easiest data gathering techniques to use. If you've got a computer or even just some notepad and a pencil, you can make a survey. You can use them for your own individual project, a team project at work, or for a volunteer organization or religious group. Want to know what the problems or needs are in your organization? Survey. Want feedback on your role as a leader or how a workshop you ran went? Survey. Looking to get a sense of the reception of a new product or campaign? Survey. Interested in the opinions of your social network on any subject, such as where the best breakfast in town can be found? Survey. One thing you can study via surveys, for example, is happiness. National Geographic and Gallup teamed up to find the happiest places on Earth. They conducted more than 250,000 interviews with people about a variety of things, including 3 different measures of how happy they were: overall life satisfaction, day-to-day happiness, and finding meaning and purpose in their lives. Their research found Denmark, Costa Rica, and Singapore to be the happiest countries on Earth. The happiest cities in the United States: Boulder, Colorado, Santa Cruz, California, and Charlottesville, Virginia. You can do a single survey of people to get a snapshot of their perspective at one point in time, or repeat the survey at regular intervals to see changes over time. You can even do an experiment within a survey by giving different questions, wording, or prompts to a sample of your respondents. For example, in one study, the researchers asked people how happy they were, but some were asked on sunny days and others on rainy days to see if the weather played a role in their self-reporting. You have a lot of choices in how to administer surveys. They can be done in person or by direct mail, phone, email, or the internet. You can imagine that some of these are going to have higher response rates than others, and getting high response rates is difficult in surveys in general, so be prepared for that. In-person interviews tend to have some of the higher response rates, partially because it's easier for the interviewer to build rapport with the respondent. Telephone interviews with a live interviewer have less of that connection, and due to call screening, lead to a lot of survey requests being ignored. Direct mail and internet surveys allow for greater anonymity for the respondent, as respondents may be less likely to worry about giving an answer an interviewer might not want to hear. They are also very convenient for the respondent, but can frequently be ignored or forgotten about. Sending introductory messages and reminders or providing a financial or other incentive are all ways you can increase your response rate regardless of which method you use. Although more and more people's concerns about privacy are inhibiting response rates and quality regardless of the mode of distribution that you use. Another factor besides your method of administration is cost. Conducting a survey can entail large costs in terms of both time and money. You have to design the questionnaire, determine the population, draw a sample, send requests, send follow-ups, and possibly train other interviewers to administer the survey. Then there are the monetary costs of printing surveys, paying interviewers, postage, or phone fees. Clearly, a massive in-person national study will cost the most, while internet surveys cost much less. In addition to being low cost, one benefit of doing surveys via the internet or email is that you can use open source survey software. You can write questions using a variety of options: open-ended questions, multiple choice questions, questions allowing you to rank a set of options, and more. Most survey software includes intuitive question templates, so you can easily ask exactly what you want to know. Survey software also lets you use branching and skip logics. These allow you to direct respondents to a specific set of questions based on what they've already answered. For example, say you work for a zoo and want to find out what the public would most want in a new exhibition. To do this, you might want to know what exhibits a person is most likely to go to: the big cats, the monkeys, the snakes. You might therefore start your survey by asking how frequently the respondent goes to the zoo. Let's say our respondent, we'll call her Danielle, said she has never been to the zoo. Well, you don't want her next question to then be what exhibits she tends to visit. That question doesn't apply to her. Using skip logic in the software, you can indicate that any respondent who answers, "I've never been to the zoo," is automatically skipped past the questions about zoo behavior. So Danielle answers never and is automatically skipped ahead. She never knows there were questions about zoo behavior, and she's less likely to stop filling out your survey because the questions don't seem to apply to her. Alternatively, you might want to know why Danielle has never been to the zoo. She is a potential new visitor. In that case, you might use branching logics, which route respondents to different parts of the survey based on their answer. Instead of skipping ahead, Danielle is taken to another part of the survey that asks questions about why she's never been to the zoo. Too busy, doesn't approve of zoos, and maybe try to find out what might make her more likely to come to your zoo in the future. Using branching logics, you can ask different questions of different respondents without making the survey experience of any one person too long or cumbersome. Now, you can do all of this without using software, but it does make it easier. And since there is user-friendly software available for free at the basic level, the monetary cost is usually quite low. You can distribute your survey via an email or by setting up a link somewhere, and therefore don't have to face the costs of copying, printing, and mailing, or hiring telephone or in-person interviewers. The least expensive option for conducting a survey is actually to use existing archived survey data, such as the General Social Survey, a national survey on American attitudes, behaviors, and attributes conducted since 1972. Don't put in the work of creating your own survey if the data you need already exists and is publicly available. The literature review should tell you what is out there already on your topic. So let's say that we've decided our project is suited to a survey and that we've settled on how we want to administer it. The next step is writing the survey. First, consider how many questions should be on your survey. The fewer questions, the more people who will be willing to respond, which gets your response rate up. But this also means you gather less data from each respondent. More questions lead to a richer data set, but people might not be as willing to participate in the first place or may quit halfway through. Survey fatigue is a real thing. One time I went to a theme park in Orlando, Florida, and after spending the entire day running around and riding roller coasters, I decided to head back to my hotel. On my way out, a young woman with a clipboard and an official-looking name tag stopped me and asked if I would complete a short survey. I agreed. She asked me a couple of questions, and I thought we were done. That would have been great. I was exhausted from too much fun, but I didn't mind giving her a minute or two. But then she tried to usher me to a seat where I'd fill out a much longer survey that would take 15 minutes. At that point, I apologized and refused. 2 minutes, I was willing to give. 15? Way too much after a long day, even though as someone who does survey research, I was very sympathetic to her need to recruit subjects. So try to find that happy medium in your survey and only ask as many questions as you absolutely need. In some cases, a single question might be enough. If you do plan to use a survey that will take a respondent's time, say 10 or 15 minutes or longer, you might consider offering an incentive. You may have encountered these offers. Fill out this survey and be entered into a drawing to win an iPad or something like that. These kinds of offers depend on your available resources, of course, but even offering a $25 gift card to one lucky respondent can be enough to encourage people to participate. If the Orlando theme park had offered a drawing for free tickets to the park, I might have found the energy to give them 15 minutes. Next, you might want to include some questions that ensure the respondent is eligible for participating in your study. If you're sampling in such a way where specific individuals were selected for the sample, then you need to make sure that the person responding is that individual. Perhaps you're interested in studying tourist perspectives on your city. In that case, you want to make sure that the person you stopped on the street is in fact a tourist. So you might want to ask them their city of residence and whether they're in town for business or pleasure. In the case of my Orlando theme park, the people doing the survey first wanted to know if I was staying at one of the theme park's on-site hotels. Presumably, if I had said no, they would have sent me on my way. Now, most of your questions are going to center on getting the necessary information on your independent and dependent variables, just as with any data gathering. But you may also want to get information on alternative and control variables, as well as information about your respondents. Many surveys, therefore, will include questions about demographics, sex, gender, age, income, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, education, religion, county or state of residency, marital status, occupation, employment status, nationality, and many others. These demographic questions can be very useful to compare subgroups within your respondents. So you can compare men to women or younger people to older people. Now, you won't necessarily ask all of these. Only ask the ones that make sense for your study and that will give you useful data. Remember that demographic questions can bring up sensitive issues, and if they're poorly worded or seem completely irrelevant, they might lead a respondent to quit your survey. This is why many people typically put demographic questions at the end of a survey, and why you include options to let people not answer questions. Now, let's talk about how to actually write all these questions that we've been discussing in a way that will give you the results that you need. Here are some tips. Tip number 1. Use plain, neutral, and objective language. We need to make sure that respondents clearly understand what we're asking so that they can give us accurate responses. That means our language must be plain, easy to understand, neutrally worded, and objective. In some cases, you may have to have your survey translated or include an interpreter in your planning. Don't use technical language or jargon that your respondents won't be able to follow. For example, I could ask you if you've recently suffered from acute rhinopharyngitis. Or I could just ask if you've had the common cold. Remember your audience. If you have to use jargon, make sure you provide a clear definition. Let's take a look at the breakfast survey we used at the start of this lecture to help us understand tip number 1. Question 1 asked, at big holidays, some people eat like birds and others like horses. What did you nosh on for breakfast at the last major holiday? I spot several major problems with this question. First, there's some jargon in here. The phrases eat like birds and eat like horses are both idioms that might be unfamiliar to some of your respondents. The word nosh is Yiddish in origin and may not be in common usage. A second problem is that even if respondents do understand all those words, they're misleading. The part about eating like birds and horses is about the amount of food they eat, while the question I'm actually asking is about what they ate. Your respondents may be confused about what you're actually asking them. Third, the use of the phrase major holiday will denote different things for different people. What is a major holiday? Does Labor Day count? What about Arbor Day? Or March 25th, known as International Waffle Day? In some places, holiday means vacation, so if you meant Thanksgiving instead of the respondent's cruise to Mexico, you better be careful. The final problem is one of memory. How likely is it that your respondents will specifically remember what they ate for breakfast on that last holiday, whatever day it might be? I can barely remember what I ate for breakfast 2 days ago. And many holidays connected with food tend to focus on a big meal later in the day, not breakfast. To fix this question, you might ask, the last time you ate something special for breakfast, what was the occasion, if any? The answer choices could be no occasion, birthday, anniversary, Thanksgiving, etc., or just leave it open-ended. Or you might ask them if they were celebrating an occasion by having a nice breakfast, what would they eat? Both of these get at the same ideas as the original question, but avoid some of those language pitfalls. Another important aspect of tip number 1 is to use objective language. That means you shouldn't use any judgmental words or tone in your questions. As researchers, we have to approach our material neutrally, and we don't want to bias our respondents to answer in any particular way. Don't try to make them answer the way you want. Instead, aim for honest responses. Question 2 said, many people consider breakfast to be the most important meal of the day, essential to good health. Do you always give breakfast to your kids every morning like a good parent, yes or no? This question is terrible. It definitely violates tip number 1. It starts by priming you with a claim about breakfast being important for good health. Note that there's no citation or quote supporting that statement. Instead, it's relying on you believing that this is common knowledge, even though this is actually a contested claim. It also assumes that you have children. Now, maybe our survey is restricted to a population that only includes parents who live with their children. If that's the case, this isn't an issue. But if this survey includes non-parents or parents of children no longer living at home, how are they supposed to answer this question? This question also states that a good parent would give breakfast to their children every morning. Imagine you're a respondent and talking to a live interviewer. You're thinking in your mind, well, typically my kids eat breakfast, but sometimes we're running late in the morning, so I don't always do this. Do you answer with complete honesty and say no? Clearly, the interviewer is implying that there's only one right answer here. You might fudge it and say yes, even though, strictly speaking, the honest answer is no. This kind of behavior is common in surveys, as respondents may try to please the interviewer. It leads to social desirability bias, something we'll discuss in our next lecture. It also creates the problem where you, as a researcher, assume that a no answer means the person is a bad parent, when the reason the respondent said no is because they don't have children or perhaps can't afford to feed their kids breakfast regularly. A question like this is simply not going to give us very useful results. There's another flaw in question 2. It uses the words always and every. This is a violation of tip number 2, which is avoid using absolutes. Absolutes such as always, never, and every may encourage respondents to answer untruthfully or may prevent us from gathering useful information. Even someone who typically doesn't eat breakfast has probably eaten breakfast at least once in their life, while someone who never skips breakfast could call to mind the one exception. So how do we fix question 2 so it follows these 2 tips? Well, we want to eliminate that first sentence, as all it does is prime our respondents to answer in a particular way. We also want to eliminate the use of the words good parents, always, and every. Instead, consider what the point of this question is. What information do we really want here? We probably want to know how often the children in the household eat breakfast. One way to find that out would be to first ask if there are any children living in the household. If the respondent says no, then skip the question about breakfast entirely so you don't waste their time. If they say yes, you might then ask, how many days a week typically does each child in the household eat breakfast? And then provide them with a way to respond for child number 1, child number 2, etc. Another way would be to ask, how many days a week do you typically serve breakfast to at least one child in the household over the age of 1? The responses can be open-ended, or you can provide a range of possible responses. Note that these new versions have no priming material or judgmental language. They're neutral. We're not giving off any signs that we will judge the respondent as a poor parent if they say 0. We also remove the absolute language, letting the respondent simply tell us the number of days. This actually gives us more useful data, as instead of comparing yes, no, we could compare 0 days to 3 or 4 days to 7 days. Notice that we also aren't lumping all the kids' behavior together. It's possible that one child eats breakfast every day and another only occasionally. Tip number 3 for good question writing is carefully consider your response options. First, you need to decide whether your question should be open or close-ended. An open-ended question doesn't offer any suggested response options. It lets the respondent say whatever they like in response. A close-ended question, what we typically call a multiple choice question, offers a set of possible responses that the respondent picks from. There are benefits and drawbacks to both. Open-ended questions are less restrictive and let people offer responses that you, as a survey creator, may not have considered. They're also great if the list of options is too long or if including a list might bias their responses. They can be difficult to code, though, as you will need to analyze the responses to find commonalities between respondents. Close-ended questions are much easier to code and typically take less time to answer, but by restricting the possible responses, you can force people into choosing options that don't quite fit them. The order of those responses can also matter. Subjects may look at a list and pick the first one that applies to them without reading the rest. Our breakfast survey questions 3 and 4 are both close-ended questions. Question 3 asked, what is the perfect breakfast meal, pancakes or eggs? And question 4 asked, what time do you eat breakfast, 6 to 7 a.m., 7 to 8 a.m., or 8 to 9 a.m.? In both questions, the respondent is given a list of all possible responses, pancakes or eggs, and time slots from 6 to 9 a.m. Consider how restricted a respondent might feel. Apparently, the perfect breakfast meal in the mind of the researcher only consists of 1 out of 2 foods. For some of us, it might be both of those things or neither. Where's the croissant, the French toast, the yogurt, and what does the word perfect mean anyway? There's a serious reliability problem there, as what is a perfect meal to me might be different than it is for you. Question 4 makes the same mistake by only giving you 3 options for the time you eat breakfast. There's no allowance for those who eat breakfast at 5 a.m., 10 a.m., or 4 p.m. There's also an assumption that you eat at the same time every day, which may not be true. To fix these, we need to consider the second part of tip number 3. The first part considered whether you should use open or close-ended questions. The second part is this. If you use close-ended questions, make sure the responses are exhaustive and exclusive. Exhaustive responses mean that there's a possible and accurate response for every single respondent. Each subject should be able to find an answer choice that applies to them. Exclusive responses mean that those answer choices don't overlap. A respondent may have trouble choosing between 2 responses such as agree or strongly agree, but they shouldn't have 2 categories that both apply, such as female and age 25 to 40, unless you want to allow them to choose every category that applies. Question 3's possible choices are neither exclusive nor exhaustive. Someone might want to select both pancakes and eggs as their perfect meal, while others would prefer toast, cereal, waffles, coffee, or any number of things I can't think of. Question 4's possible choices are also neither exclusive nor exhaustive. Someone who eats at 7 a.m., for example, could choose either 6 to 7 a.m. or 7 to 8 a.m. and still be giving an accurate answer. Meanwhile, someone who eats later in the day or never eats at all has no response choice that applies to them. Let's try to fix questions 3 and 4 by applying tip number 3. First, question 3 about our perfect breakfast meal is probably better off as an open-ended question. That allows people to be as imaginative as they want without having to conform to what the researcher might consider a perfect breakfast. It also leaves the option of people saying none. So we might just say, describe your perfect breakfast meal, or if we want to make sure that people focus on the food and not the location or setting, list the food and drink items in your perfect breakfast meal. As for question 4, this could also be open-ended, but honestly, it doesn't need to be. Listing some times of day won't restrict imagination regarding when people eat breakfast. Depending on how specific my research question requires me to be, I might change the response options to 2 or 3 hour ranges and use descriptive categories such as early and late morning. I would include ranges for all hours of the day and an option that says, I don't eat breakfast, I don't know, other, and I prefer not to answer to make sure it's truly exhaustive. Next up is tip number 4. Avoid double-barreled questions. A double-barreled question is one that asks 2 questions under the guise of asking only one. It usually happens because we're trying to cram a lot of ideas into a single question and don't realize that the response to one part of the question might be different from the response to the other. That's the danger of the double-barreled question. We can't rely on the results because we don't know which part of the question our respondents are answering. Let's look at question 5 in our breakfast survey. Question 5 asked, on a scale from 1 to 5, where 1 means strongly disagree, 3 is neutral, and 5 is strongly agree, how do you respond to the statement? I make time for breakfast every day and I eat it at my kitchen table with my family. Do you see the double barreling here? It's actually triple barreled. I'm asking you about whether you eat breakfast every day and whether you eat it at a kitchen table and whether you eat it with your family. You might have a respondent who does eat breakfast every day, strongly agree, but only sometimes at her kitchen table. Is that agree, neutral, disagree, and never with her family, strongly disagree? How should she answer this question? If I want accurate results on all of these things, I need to ask about them as separate questions. I can still use the same prompt with the 1 to 5 scale, but then I should have my respondents rate each item separately. So they should use the scale to rate their agreement with 3 things. I typically make time for breakfast each day. I typically eat breakfast at my kitchen table, and I typically eat breakfast with at least 1 member of my family. This change will give me all the information I want without forcing my respondent to choose which part of the question to answer accurately. I can get accurate responses to all 3 parts of my question instead by making sure everything is single-barreled. Finally, tip number 5, adapt from existing resources. Survey research has decades of history, and there are many guides out there on how to write good survey questions. In the case of demographic questions, for example, you can and should draw on existing models. It not only lets you take advantage of expert advice, but also allows you to potentially compare your results to those of other researchers investigating similar subjects. Existing resources will also advise you on important issues such as question order. You may notice that a lot of surveys will start with simpler and non-controversial questions before moving on to tougher questions. You'll see that similar topics get grouped together, and you may get a strong sense of what a typical length or set of topics might be for survey research in your area. Use these resources and adapt them for your needs rather than starting from scratch. There are plenty of survey research software options out there to assist you. As we discussed earlier, they can help you quickly build a survey with all kinds of different question options. Not just open-ended and multiple choice, but checkboxes, rank ordering items, scales, and all kinds of other options. Even better, they can produce reports for you, running basic descriptive statistics and showing you graphs and tables so you can see patterns in the responses. That brings us to the end of this lecture, but not our discussion of surveys. Next time, we're going to look at public opinion polls, a particular kind of survey, and consider a few more important ideas on survey research.